Let's talk about TikTok's US valuation, because the headline number, 14 billion, keeps getting repeated like it's a settled truth. It isn't. First, let's be clear about what that number is and isn't. It's not global TikTok. It's not China's Douyin. It's a US carve-out, an American-controlled entity with its own board and its own security plumbing. That's the perimeter. That's the thing being priced. We value US TikTok against US revenue, not worldwide revenue. When you take 14 billion and divide it by US sales, you land at roughly 2 times revenue, give or take, depending on assumptions. That's the right ballpark. Now, how does 2 times look against peers you actually know and trade? For starters, Snap tends to live near 2.7 times revenue. Pinterest sits closer to 5 or 6. Reddit at IPO levels pushed into 7 to 8. In other words, TikTok US is being priced below every peer, despite being the usage leader and cultural center of gravity for short-form video. That is not a subtle signal, which raises the obvious question. Is this just cautious, or is it deliberately cautious? When a senior official floats a number before a term sheet is signed, that's not color commentary, that's anchoring. It looks like the White House's so-called bully pulpit is being used to talk down the sellers, to set a reference point that's harder to escape later. Alright, so who's actually buying the US arm of TikTok, aka TikTok Lite? The consortium includes recognizable names like Larry Ellison, Rupert Murdoch, and Michael Dell, with Silver Lake as the lead private equity firm. That mix gives you capital, legacy distribution, and traditional content chops. What it doesn't give you is a proven playbook for operating a modern, user-generated social platform at global scale. At best, Larry holds a minority stake tied to Skydance Paramount, which is run by his son. Murdoch once owned MySpace and exited in a fire sale. Silver Lake has deep entertainment exposure and once invested in Twitter, but they're financial sponsors, not day-to-day operators. Some existing TikTok investors will roll into the new structure, but that's passive equity, not operating muscle. Even with roughly 80% US equity ownership, the US entity is expected to license IP and algorithmic technology from ByteDance. That means royalty flows back to the parent. Yes, some economics leak out of the US perimeter by design. It shouldn't break the multiple math, but it does matter for margins and long-run value capture. Alright, with all that in mind, let's now step back and look at how differently the US is handling TikTok's Chinese ownership. Because the contrast with the EU and Australia says a lot about how each country thinks about privacy, control, and risk. The US is solving those risks through 80% ownership of the US operations and a to-be-determined governance structure. It's reported that the US-domiciled operations will include a board stacked with national security and cybersecurity credentials. At the other end of the spectrum, Europe and Australia are addressing privacy and algorithm risks through regulation and fines. Both approaches tackle the same anxiety, but Australian and European TikTok users will be using a version with over 800 million users, run by the same entity that made TikTok a global success. Meanwhile, US users of TikTok Lite will gather in a smaller community of about 100 million users, fed by a different algorithm. And that user base does not include other Western democracies. That raises all kinds of questions about non-compete agreements between ByteDance and the Oracle Consortium. Can TikTok Lite poach users in the UK and Australia, for example? Presumably, the new owners will want to expand abroad. But does that include Hong Kong? Mainland China? All we know for sure is that TikTok is about to split into 2 very different tools for different theaters. We know ByteDance can make money and retain users with the TikTok algorithm. We have no idea how the new US owners will fare. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a number that screens cheap against peers. It leaves us with a slate of owners long on capital, distribution, and content, but short on social operating experience. It leaves us with licensing dependencies that shave some economics off the US operations and no clarity on non-compete boundaries. And it leaves us with the most important question of all: who is going to run the platform? Not the balance sheet, the platform. The community where creators, advertisers, and users interact. The unglamorous work, moderation, product speed, ad safety, the stuff that decides if TikTok thrives or limps. If you want a single line to carry into your next conversation, carry this one. At $14 billion for TikTok US, we're looking at roughly 2 times US revenue, a discount to every peer, priced like a political anchor rather than a market-clearing level, and backed by a group with capital and content, not a proven social media playbook. Everything else, the board names, the committee charters, the royalty splits, flows from that center of gravity. Numbers first, politics second, operations last. And the operations will decide whether this actually works. It is simply too early to say whether it's quote-unquote safe to use TikTok Lite.